Welcome everyone to this devotional series, Uprooting Racism. And I'm so excited to present Sue St. Clair to us. And I know she needs no introduction since she's so dearly loved by all of us. I do just want to give you a few highlights so that you can really appreciate all the expertise and knowledge that she brings today to the conversation. And so I just wanted to mention that as most of you know, she's been in nursing and practicing psychiatric health. I know you'll probably do a better job presenting you than I will, but I'm going to try my best. And she worked for USAID for a while in West Africa, giving her a lot of international experience. She has a master's degree in nursing and an international public health. She's done work for over 20 plus years in psychiatry, specifically psychiatric nursing. And so if you can just join me in welcoming her, and I will pass it on to her, and I'm going to make you co-host here. There we go. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Liz. Good morning, everyone. It's really good to be here. And the subject that I have chosen to focus on is not an easy one. And I never know how people are going to receive it because it's about racism and different aspects of it each time that I share my understanding, because that's all it is. But this time, one of the things that struck me was what the House of Justice called a profound deviation in true morality. And as I thought about that, I thought about how distorted we are in the human spirit. So that's the title, The Distortion of Racism, the Distortion of the Human Spirit. So I'm going to start. And at certain points, I will stop just to ask a question and see if anyone has a thought that they would like to share regarding what is being shared. Oh, I gotta get back. So pause here for just a second to really get a vision, to get a visual of what this represents, especially when we talk about the form of slavery and continued oppression and degradation that exists here in America.
It seems despite questions concerning the reliability of Greek scholars and historians like Diodorus Siculus and Herodotus, their work highlights a very important narrative that did exist in ancient times. Whether their words about Africa were true or not, they expose what the common discourse was in ancient times amongst elites, an ancient commentary that influenced later periods. Some of the ancient narratives suggest the belief, or at least the consideration, that Africans were the first people and also that they were among the first civilized. Now the Ethiopians, as historians relate, were the first of all men, and the proofs of this statement, they say, are manifest. for that they did not come into their land as immigrants from abroad, but were natives of it, and so justly bear the name of autochthons, is, they maintain, conceded by practically all men. Furthermore, that those who dwell beneath the noonday sun were, in all likelihood, the first to be generated by the earth, is clear to all, since inasmuch as it was the warmth of the sun which, at the generation of the universe, dried up the earth when it was still wet and impregnated it with life, it is reasonable to suppose that the region which was nearest the sun was the first to bring forth living creatures. I find it fascinating that a Greek scholar came to a similar conclusion as we did concerning the origin of humans, placing them on the African continent. Echoes of this narrative survived into more modern times. One of the most popular Orientalists known today as the general title Middle Eastern Studies was a man named Constantine de Volney of the 18th century. Here's what he has to say. We have the strongest reasons to believe that the country neighboring to the tropic Sudan and southern Egypt was the cradle of the sciences, and of consequence that the first learned nation was a nation of blacks, for it is incontrovertible that by the term Ethiopians, the ancients meant to represent a people of black complexion, thick lips, and woolly hair. Despite what our perspective is today, people in ancient times and even some of the earliest observers concluded that humanity's oldest civilizations and people were Africans. It's important to note that this perspective was only recently challenged. I think if we use this ancient perspective and the perspective proposed by de Volney, we can certainly see the beginning stages of how African people came to be viewed as a threat, because the implications of being the oldest human people possessing the oldest civilizations is obvious. The second reason why African people may have been viewed as a threat plays on the previous ancient model. Because of the narrative advanced by ancient writers and their modern contemporaries, a primordial fear of genetic annihilation inevitably developed. So the thought process could possibly be the following. If these Africans are the oldest humans who possibly spread throughout the planet, then humanity can easily go back to its original African mold. Even though it may sound odd, this was a thread of thought in the psychology of the one-drop rule, which pretty much stated that if anyone had one drop of African blood, then they have corrupted the non-African blood and therefore should be considered black or Negro. It seems clear that this idea was developed to identify African ancestry in whatever color or phenotype it came in. This identification would then lead to oppressing that individual, keeping them in the same denigrated state as other black people so that they would not have to compete economically, socially, politically, and especially genetically. However, this idea of genetic annihilation was not present amongst all European ethnic groups. In Latin America, threat seems to come from the fact that the African continent holds so many resources, and these resources ultimately come from the fact that the African continent is that genetic threat. So there does seem to be some duality there. All in all, the idea of Africans posing a genetic threat did not apply to all, but was unique to some non-African groups with imperial power. Our final threat seems to come from the fact that the African continent holds so many resources, and these resources ultimately translate into wealth. It's no secret that many modern-day nations want to control the resources coming out of Africa, and they do a good job at it. This was certainly true in ancient and medieval times. I think the Arabs were well aware of this when they first encountered the Ghana and Mali empires. Muslim who knew about its wealth wanted a piece of it. As we can see, the Arabs encouraged it, making a proverb out of it. And Mansa Musa's visit to Cairo, displaying his vast wealth and power, certainly oohed and awed, but it simply gave more reason to heighten fears of a black planet, if you will, because everyone knew that access to wealth and resources consolidates and increases power, period, and whoever owns it controls it. And it's clear that Africans were deemed as the owners, first from the Arab perspective and later the European. This was indeed a fatal combination for Africans who were seemingly more interested in other forms of capital rather than world domination. And so, this history paints an interesting picture of why Africans and their descendants may be viewed as a threat. The early narrative of Africans being the first humans, the limited yet ever-present idea of genetic annihilation, and finally, the perceived advantage of immediate access to wealth and resources made Africans a threat to their neighbors, the Arabs and the Europeans, both of which took action as soon as they could. I believe this is why there was so much pushback against Pan-African movements and economic powerhouses like Black Wall Street and others, because if people of African descent all across the globe can consolidate a unified identity, they can then become owners again. Anyway, guys, like I mentioned before, this is just my own personal analysis.
I played those parts of that presentation because it coincided with other areas of research that was saying virtually the same thing. And I wanted to revisit what he was sharing regarding the reasons for Africans being a threat. One was their civilizations. They represented the oldest civilizations. New research that's coming out in the 2000s is really reinforcing that and going back not just to the Ethiopians, but all the way back to the first recognized civilized society, which was Sumer, the Sumerians. And Sumer or Sumerians meant Black people. Before that, in another presentation I shared about the development, before they even started migrating to other areas of the world, the development that took place within Africa itself. But going forward, back to this threat. So they recognized that, didn't like it. They also felt that, and I'm talking about Arabs and Europeans, they also felt that the Blackness was such a strong genetic makeup that it would end up causing whiteness to disappear. And so this primordial fear of genetic annihilation is what led to, and consciously or unconsciously, to the idea of one drop of blood rule. The last one, and probably the one that's the most impactful, even today, has to do with the competition for economic and social power, being the ones in control. And they were perceived, Africans, the African continent, was perceived as being very, very wealthy, and it was in control of Black people. And so first the Arabs and then the Europeans gradually over time, and I believe it began in 800 AD, gradually over time began to infiltrate those African civilizations that had so much wealth. And the Ghanaian civilization was one that was highlighted in that video. So I wanted to just go back to that to give an idea of where things may have started to get to where we are today. And this is just a little bit more along those lines. The first actual invasion of Africa took place in the 15th century by the Portuguese. And by the 16th century, they already were starting to have an African slave trade. So already, now this wasn't new, having slaves or getting slaves from Africa to other areas in the Middle East or in the parts of Europe that were closer to Africa. But I'm not going to talk about that type of slavery because it was very, very different. And it was those individuals became members of the household, they intermarried, they were educated, and so on. But these Africans were forced to work in plantations and mines in the colonies of the New World. Other Europeans, seeing the wealth of the property as well as the wealth of the land, wanted in on it. And so the transatlantic slave trade began in the 1500s and continued until the mid-1800s, arguably speaking, because we know that even after the mid-1800s, it has continued here in the United States. So even after it ended, we have what took place. We have the imperialization and the colonization of the country. And this was just as what happened here in the US. This was taking over the land and saying this country belongs to us. And we are going to share the wealth among ourselves, European countries, and we're going to exploit and export Africans as well. Now, fast forwarding a little bit again, we go to the form of chattel slavery, which is the kind of slavery that existed in America. And I'm going to read this passage from Hussein Bulhan, who talked about the psychology of oppression in his book. The middle passage uprooted bodies, transporting them to alien lands, dislocated psyches, imposing an alien worldview, the uprooting of psyches from their culture to their insertion into another, in which the basic values were pro-white and anti-Black, elicited a victimization difficult to quantify, but very massive. To acquiesce to and embrace the oppressor's culture, leaving behind what is left of one's own, is to plunge oneself into profound alienation in all its varieties and anguish. And we know that not only did that happen, that anyone that came as families were separated. People's languages were separated from people of the same language. Anything to disengage them from who they really are. As a result, there were many individuals that spoke out, but one of them is one we know well, which is W.E.B. Du Bois, who wrote in Souls of Black Folk about the double consciousness that Black men have. And now this is on the Black side, this is part of the distortion of the human spirit. This sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity, to explain American racial minorities' self-perception being heavily influenced by the white majority's perception of them. He calls this a two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body. Bulhan talks about this as a Manichean psychology that permeates the prevailing values and beliefs. The oppressor identifies himself in terms of the sublime and beauty, while depicting the oppressed in terms of absolute evil and ugliness. This creates a worldview where the group doing the oppressing, in America, this means white people, is always the example of everything positive. It is aligned with the white racial frame in teaching us that whites and everything related to whites is superior. There's an old adage in the Black community that we would prefer to buy our ice from the white man because his ice is colder than that purchased from the Black man. The oppressor without becomes an oppressor within. The well-known inferiority complex of the oppressed originates in this process of internalization. Because of this internalization and its attendant but repressed rage, the oppressed may act out on each other, the very violence imposed on them. They become autopressors as they engage in self-destructive behavior, injurious to themselves, their loved ones, and their neighbors. I want to just make a comment aside as an example of this. I was a pioneer to Liberia in West Africa. Liberia was the only country other than Ethiopia that was not colonized by the Europeans. However, it was colonized by former slaves and freedmen from America back in 1821, 22, something like that. But because of what they knew, what they internalized when they got to Liberia, they did the same thing with the native peoples of that country. And when I went, there had just recently been a coup in which the native peoples of the country took over the government because they had decided they'd had enough, and they no longer wanted to be oppressed by these people who were also Black like them. So for us as Black people living in America, these are the things that we end up having to deal with. Daily struggle, constantly balancing to fit the white middle class values, developing the skills known as code switching, where people of color switch back and forth from being whom they are to being who whites accept them as. And Hussein Bulhan talks about everything that we know already, and especially those of us who are Black, we know the school, the history books, the comic strips, the theater halls, and there's examples of comic strips, there's examples of cartoons that I watched as a child and had forgotten what they were like until I was doing some research. And when I saw it as an adult, it's like, whoa, I watched this and I took it in without even realizing. So the schoolboy gets to the social circle of the oppressor, the more he learns to disparage what he is by birth and race. On the one hand, he is assimilated. On the other, he's made to break away from his own culture. I am finding more and more appreciation for James Baldwin. I want you to listen to this. I want you to watch the body language, and I'm going to stop the video after that to hear what you may have to say.
I would like to add someone to our group here. Professor Paul Weiss, a Sterling Professor of Philosophy at Yale. Were you able to listen to the show backstage?
I heard a good deal of it, but then I was behind the rostrum gate.
Yes.
So I heard only some of it.
Did you hear anything that you disagreed with? Or
I disagreed with a great deal of it. And, of course, there's a good deal I agree with. But I think he's overlooking one very important matter, I think. Each one of us, I think, is terribly alone. He lives his own individual life. He has all kinds of obstacles in the way of religion or color or size or shape or lack of ability, and the problem is to become a man.
But what I was discussing was not that problem, really. I was discussing the difficulties, the obstacles, the very real danger of death thrown up by the society when a black man attempts to become a man.
All this emphasis upon black man and white does emphasize something which is here, but it emphasizes it or perhaps exaggerates it, and therefore makes us put people together in groups which they ought not to be in. I have more in common with a black scholar than I have with a white man who's against scholarship. And you have more in common with a white author than you have with someone who's against all literature. So why must we always concentrate on color or on religion or this? There are other ways of connecting men.
I'll tell you this. When I left this country in 1948, I left this country for one reason only, one reason. I didn't care where I went. I might have gone to Hong Kong, I might have gone to Timbuktu. I ended up in Paris, on the streets of Paris, with $40 in my pocket on the theory that nothing worse could happen to me there than had already happened to me here. You talk about making it as a writer by yourself. You had to be able then to turn off all the antenna with which you live, because once you turn your back on this society, you may die. You may die. And it's very hard to sit at a typewriter and concentrate on that if you're afraid of the world around you. The years I lived in Paris did one thing for me. They released me from that particular social terror, which was not the paranoia of my own mind, but a real social danger visible in the face of every cop, every boss, everybody. I don't know what most white people in this country feel, but I can only conclude what they feel from the state of their institutions. I don't know if white Christians hate Negroes or not, but I know that we have a Christian church which is white and a Christian church which is black. I know, as Malcolm X once put it, that the most segregated hour in American life is high noon on Sunday. That says a great deal for me about a Christian nation. It means that I can't afford to trust most white Christians and certainly cannot trust the Christian church. I don't know whether the labor unions and their bosses really hate me. That doesn't matter, but I know I'm not in their unions. I don't know if the real estate lobby is anything against black people, but I know the real estate lobbies keep me in the ghetto. I don't know if the Board of Education hates black people, but I know the textbooks I give my children to read and the schools that we have to go to. Now, this is the evidence. You want me to make an act of faith, risking myself, my wife, my woman, my sister, my children, on some idealism which you assure me exists in America, which I have never seen.
Thoughts? And I'll just take a few. What did you see?
The white man did have no clue about the black man's life at all, like what struggles he has to go through. And, you know, it was just like trying to intellectualize the problem he has, like, you know, overlooking race at all. Like, you know, why don't you look at the commonalities you have with a white author, you know? So it was very ignorance of the white professor.
Thank you, Nasmi. What about the body language?
In terms of the body language, what I noticed was that when the professor first came in and sat down, he was very much in his space. I was like, whoa, he is too close. He's like spit in his face. Didn't he wipe his eye at one point like he spit on his face? He was way too close to him. But as Baldwin began to talk, then the professor began to lean back and actually give him his space. And by the end of the time he was talking, he had fully gained back to his personal space and saying what he wanted to say. That's what I noticed.
Excellent, Olivia. Yeah, both of those are excellent comments. One more if anyone has one.
I would like to, hi, my name is James. I'm on Shireen's phone. I would like to say that it just shows so what I see is that there are good, really good white folks who are, you know, are people who are not black and support black people and want that equality. But I think, like this professor shows, that he's ignorant to the reality, or he's turned a blind eye to the reality. You can't be 100% ignorant to the reality of a black man in America. So he's turned maybe a blind eye and just focused on his craft. I think that what he wants in America is that commonality. I think what he wants is these things, but until America can let go of the racial problem, those things won't come. So I think, you know, there can be that relationship he was describing, but it can't happen until racism is let go of.
Thank you. Okay, let's go back. Oh, it's still on. I thought it would stop where I stopped. Let me see here. Okay. Okay, so we do know this fact about white men considering themselves superior to Black men. One of the things that I noticed, Dick, what's his name? What was his name? Dick, can't remember his last name, but the interviewer, the way he introduced the professor, and then when the professor came in, the way he sat, where he crossed his leg and kind of leaned back, but in a very uplifting his body, so that here I am. I'm the authority. I'm ready to speak. So that was one of the things that I saw. So Black men want to prove to white men at all costs the richness of their own thought, the equal value of their own intellect. To speak a language is to take on a world, a culture. The fact of having to speak nothing but the other's language, when the other was the conqueror, ruler, and oppressor, was at once an affirmation of him, his worldview, and his values, that of the oppressor, a concession to his framework, an estrangement from one's own history, values, and outlook. And as we may know, to some degree or another, depends on whether we're Black or white or Persian, racism has wounded generations of non-whites far more deeply than whites will ever know. How can they when they have not experienced a similar kind of wounding? Many whites, however, still partake of the privileges of color bequeathed to them by the legacy of historic racism, unable or unwilling to divest themselves of the advantages of being white in a world that still touts white cultural values and allocates rewards for accepting such values. Racial fear and hatred still dominate interracial interactions. Just to now backtrack just a bit to look at where this all came from as far as white people and Black people. This didn't always exist. Before the 17th, 16th century, there was no such thing as white people. If someone were to, or white race, if someone were to say something about a person's color, it was simply a matter of description, but not because they saw color. Whereas now people say, well, I don't see color, but they saw it, but it didn't mean anything to them. So in the late 17th century, the term white race began to take on a life of its own. And if I remember correctly, it began with the German quasi-scientists who began the process. And of course, it progressed more and more. And the concept of whiteness is now a particular resonance in these countries, in the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, United Kingdom, and South Africa. This whole distortion of the human spirit as it relates to racism, although it is so in your face, the suffering and the trauma and the oppression and the degradation of Black people, those people who do it, their suffering may be more hidden, but they have to be suffering just as well because they are not fulfilling their roles as human beings put on this earth by God to acquire virtues and to live out those virtues. And this is one white man's account, just briefly, of what he understands is the hidden wound. You begin to awaken to the realities of what you know. You are subject to staggering recognitions of your complicity in history and in the events of your own life. Of this wound, this psychic and emotional damage that racism does to white people, he writes, I have borne it all my life, always with the most delicate consideration for the pain I would feel if I were somehow forced to acknowledge it. That whole term, cognitive dissonance, that has to be maintained. The crisis of racial awareness, the sense of being doomed by my history to be, if not always a racist, then a man always limited by the inheritance of racism, condemned to be always conscious of the necessity not to be a racist, to be always dealing deliberately with the reflexes of racisms that are embedded in my mind as deeply as the language I speak. I'm going to read that again. To be always dealing deliberately with the reflexes of racisms that are embedded in my mind as deeply as the language I speak. And then this whole, this is about the book, that he finds the stain of racism so stubborn that it would be foolish to think anyone can be exempt, individually or collectively. And then in the last third, there's a section where he talks about, and I didn't read the book, I'm going to get it, but for what I did read about the book, his understanding about himself as a white man, filled with racism, is growing up with two Black adults, a male and a female, whom he loved and valued and learned from and wanted to be like because of what he saw in their spirits. And that's what allowed him, by having that close relationship, that is what allowed him to understand about himself and what he needed to do within his own mind and heart to become something different and to continually work at that process. We are all, I think, familiar with Robin DiAngelo, who coined the term, oh, I'm sorry, I don't have this in. That's why it was. Okay, we're all familiar with this term, with Robin DiAngelo, who coined the term white fragility and what she says about it. And basically, without reading this whole thing, what it amounts to is that the fragility is that there is such a tight rein within the white consciousness regarding that wound that they carry. And it's such a tight bond around it so that they themselves can't even see it, that when they are even minutely exposed to some aspect of it, they find it extremely painful to be able to see it. And so for them to unpack that understanding about themselves, they have to be willing to accept the pain and the discomfort that comes with it. I'm going to play this because I thought it was a powerful example of what has been happening over the decades since the development of this country and the way in which we would have fits and starts as it related to trying to reach equity for Blacks and whites.
Okay, my white people, here's an important message from a Black friend. As difficult and exhausting as this moment is, and it is, it's just going to get more challenging and more uncomfortable. But of all the battles you have to fight, the biggest one is white fatigue. Let me explain. White supremacy is the pernicious narrative that white people are superior to Black folks and just about everyone else. White fatigue is what happens when most white people who don't want to think of themselves as white supremacists and who might even fight that narrative get tired, give up, and let white supremacy win. Alexander Hamilton is the poster child of white fatigue. He belonged to an anti-slavery society, but when we adopted the Constitution, he agreed to the 3/5 compromise, white fatigue's original sin. Men like Hamilton felt they couldn't get a constitution without slavery, so they gave up trying and gave actual slave owners more power. After the Civil War, we put amendments in the Constitution to guarantee equal black citizenship. White supremacy formed a resistance, but it was white fatigue that lost the cause. We pulled Union troops from the South, and a Supreme Court full of Northerners paved the way to Jim Crow and streets full of Constellation trophies. White supremacy put them up, but white fatigue whistled past them every day for over a century. The Civil Rights Movement tried to stop white supremacy by shaking most white people out of white fatigue, disrupt normal, televised violence of white supremacists to jolt people sleepwalking through white fatigue. And for a minute, it worked. Hope and equality were adrenaline shots to the conscience of America. We got a second Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the Fair Housing Act. But Martin Luther King had to die to get that last one. And then we got white fatigue. Too tired to win the war on poverty, white fatigue let it become the war on crime, then the war on drugs. White fatigue mistook mass incarceration for justice. And then a pandemic hit. White eyes opened as black and brown bodies filled the front lines, and a host of hardly paid people were labeled essential. And then this. A knee to the neck of the facade of American equality, and an image taken by a courageous black girl just as the nation's eyes were already opening. And suddenly, white America is more awake to the distance between white life and black life than it has ever been. But right now, black America is losing sleep over white fatigue. It looms larger than any president, no matter how much of a white supremacist one proved himself to be. He might be defeated, but if the majority of white people get tired, or too busy, or distracted, or fooled into thinking we've actually won, this momentum will be killed by white fatigue. I'm telling you right now, it's gonna get more uncomfortable. It's going to be confusing and exhausting. You will want it to stop. But do not stop. New legislation isn't the end. This election isn't the end. There is no end because white supremacy will never quit, so black people cannot ever quit. You must battle white fatigue. Don't get tired. Don't ever give up. Do not wave the white flag.
So, Beverly Tatum states, in order to prevent chronic discomforts, whites may learn not to notice. But in not noticing, one loses opportunities for greater insight into oneself and one's experience. A significant dimension of who one is in the world, one's whiteness, remains uninvestigated, and perceptions of daily experience are routinely distorted. Privilege goes unnoticed, and all but the most blatant acts of racial bigotry are ignored. Not noticing requires energy. Another little video. We know him as an actor, but there's a lot more to him than that.
I understand that it.
I personally believe because that's an ugly part of human nature. Yeah. What happens every once in a while is the veil is lifted and we see it even more clearly. It has to be an awakening and an epiphany for people when they see it for the first time, you know? And what happens in the journey of life is we're always trying to evolve to get better. That's why we go and have these moments of trying to understand the human spirit. That's what art is about, where we reflect on who we are, where we've been. So the issues that we're having with race now is understanding that this amorphic dysfunction in our human spirit is
amorphic dysfunction in our human spirit. And this is all of what we're talking about today. One of the things that's coming to light is how the global spread of a microscopic virus is placing the ravages of racism and inequity under the microscope. But the fact is, we don't all see the same thing. Racism has a way of actually distorting our vision. Intertwined with many other forms of social domination, racism is mercurial, innovative, even viral. Our own Universal House of Justice has stated in a different way that it develops countervailing processes to continue things as they are, or make them, from the Black perspective, even worse. Countervailing, that means that ways to go around it, above it, under it, or right through it. So you develop laws for voting. Well, we're just going to make it more difficult for you to get to vote. We'll change the times of the days. We'll change the days of the week. Black people can vote best on Sundays because that's the only day they usually are off from work. Well, we're not going to have any voting on Sundays. You get the message. That's only one thing. And this is Ruha Benjamin, whom we all know and hopefully love for all of what she is also releasing into the world. This is a new book that I was looking at. It looks like it hasn't been released yet, but what I came across was her comments about the book, and these were the comments that she made. Anti-Blackness distorts reality, interpersonally and institutionally, exposing Black people to a threatening environment well before the pandemic, even in childhood. So I mentioned the House of Justice a couple of times. I pray I reach those moments when I never know when what's in my heart ends up welling up into my throat. That's just the way it is. But I pray that we are all deeply studying every message that the House of Justice is releasing. Of course, all the time, ever since they were created, but especially now as it deals with this issue, because they're being so clear and so definitive about what's going on in America. They're putting it before our faces the same as Shoghi Effendi did. They're letting us know what we are up against and how we want to understand it. So in the work that we're trying to do, we know what we are fighting against. Baha'u'llah talked about us as being soldiers in God's army. Well, we have to know what the enemy is and where it is in order to be able to address it. These are some of the terms the House of Justice has used as it relates to racism in America. And if you haven't looked up the terms, I encourage you to do so, because that's when you're really going to understand the depth and breadth of what they're telling us. Baneful, cancerous affliction, patent evil, transmuted into forms that are multifaceted everywhere you look, less blatant and more intricate, and thus more intractable, very difficult, if not impossible, to alleviate. Refers back to, there are Baha'is who will say that Shoghi Effendi, what he wrote in the Advent of Divine Justice was back in the 1930s. It doesn't apply anymore. We don't have racism like that anymore. Well, the House of Justice referred us back to that phrase in the Advent of Divine Justice, where Shoghi Effendi called it a long and thorny road, beset with pitfalls. And as we do this work, if we do this work the way we're called to do this work, we're going to have those pitfalls. Everything that we do is on a long and thorny road. We don't know what the end of it is going to look like, but we do know that to make a difference, we're going to have to walk it. They talk about a pernicious blight on American society. Dire warnings that Abdu'l-Baha gave. You know, we talk about Abdu'l-Baha being so loving, so kind, so talking about the oneness of mankind, like multiple flowers in the garden. Yeah, he did that when he came here, because that he wanted to introduce to a people that knew nothing of understanding about the oneness of mankind. He wanted to get into our minds and hearts some idea of what that was. But at the same time, what people don't often talk about, he did give us dire warnings. He told us that if we didn't address the issue of racism, that hasten ye to destruction. He told us that blood would run in the streets. So it wasn't all sweetness and light that Abdu'l-Baha came to share with us. And then Shoghi Effendi took it further in a trenchant analysis, clear, definitive. It had to be able to understand it the way he stated it. The Universal House of Justice went on to call it a devastating ferocity. And what I mentioned earlier about countervailing processes, overt or covert, forces of oppression, long and thorny road that still lie ahead, a profound deviation from the standard of true morality. And if we are to think about it, this country was built on racism. And so we have no idea what true morality looks like. We have no idea. The only standard we have to go by is the standard that Baha'u'llah has brought. The only standard we have to go by is the standard that Abdu'l-Baha and Shoghi Effendi and the Universal House of Justice is reinforcing for us. The only standard we have to go by are the plans that are released ever so many years, where they tell us what to do in order to reach that. So we're like, as Ruhia Khanum talked about when she talked about faith, that's what faith is. It's working in the dark, not being able to see the light. Maybe we'll see little glimmerings of the light that lets us know we're on the right path, but we still have to put one foot in front of the other. We still have to do the work we're called to do, so that at some point we'll get to see what that true morality looks like. One more, James Baldwin.
Growing up, I was taught in American history books that Africa had no history, and neither did I. That I was a savage, about whom the less said the better, who had been saved by Europe and brought to America. And of course, I believed it. I didn't have much choice. Those are the only books there were. I am stating very seriously, and this is not an overstatement, that I picked the cotton, and I carried its market, and I built the railroads under someone else's whip for nothing. For nothing. If one has got to prove one's title to the land, isn't 400 years enough? 400 years, at least 3 wars. The American soil is full of the corpses of my ancestors. Why is my freedom or my citizenship or my right to live there, how is it conceivably a question now? What we are not facing is the results of what we've done. what one begs the American people to do for all our sakes is simply to accept our history until the moment comes when we, the Americans, we, the American people, we are trying to forge a new identity for which we need each other. Until this moment, there is scarcely any hope for the American dream, because the people who are denied participation in it, by their very presence, will wreck it.
Robin DiAngelo called racism a white problem. So did Chunky Effendi. Malcolm Gladwell states if you're a white person who would like to treat Black people as equals in every way, who would like to have a set of association with Blacks that are as positive as those that you have with whites, it requires more than a simple commitment to equality. It requires that you change your life. A simple statement, a simple prescription, but how very difficult to do. Everything positive occurs in relationships. Ijeoma Oluo states the beauty of anti-racism is that you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be an anti-racist. Anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself. And it's the only way forward. Just a brief look at this. I'll stop it then for a minute because I want your response again.
Which doll is the black doll? And which one is the white doll?
That one.
Which doll is the pretty doll? Which doll is the nice doll? Which doll is the bad doll? Which doll is the nice doll? And which doll is the bad doll? And why is that doll pretty?
Because she's white and he has 2 eyes.
Which doll is the ugly doll? Why is that doll ugly?
Because he's black.
Which doll looks most like you?
Like me?
Yeah, which one looks like you?
And that one.
Okay.
That doll.
Thoughts?
Hi, this is Margarita. I apologize because everybody, some of you may know I had a stroke, and so I'm not able to speak very well. But anyway, there's a lot of things that occurred when I was hearing the presentation, which, you know, it's a seriously a very embedded situation, and it has a lot of aspects and things that we haven't even started to touch on. But as an ignorant person, I have questions from my ignorance, and one of them is the origins of racism, and actually where did that whole thing start? And maybe someone knows that. I don't know. Also, I think one of the biggest things that human man has created is the not recognizing the progressive revelation. which is what seems to be a very important part of our spiritual evolution. And so it seems that, turning Jesus white has been a detriment and has stopped our spiritual advancement. And so, unfortunately, everybody believed it. And I think that is, in my opinion, one of the main problems with humanity is the concept of the progressive revelation has not been embraced. The other thing is the unity. Humanity has no concept of unity that you just said. We don't even know what it's like. And then about white fatigue, I'm just going to hit on the third things that I've listened to so far is I've also noticed white fatigue, and it seems that now white people are taking over the ownership of taking over the ownership of allowing Black people to heal. And so rather than accept the fact that you have a healing, white people have a healing themselves to do, they start acting like it's their, they are the ones who give people permission to heal. The Black people now they feel like they are the ones who should give permission rather than just listening and stopping and starting that same pattern of being those who are in charge. So those are the things that I've heard in this presentation. And I'm sorry about my speech, but I just wanted to say those are the things that I heard during the presentation.
Margarita, thank you so much for for all of your thoughts, and so glad to have you here. And your speech was fine. I understood everything. So now these children, these Black children, and the two dolls, black and white, and what they had to say. And you can probably guess these children, they look like toddlers. They look like maybe 3, 4, 5 at the oldest. What are your thoughts? What have they already internalized? And what about the project itself?
I think that's the most shocking thing, that they are so young to form such opinions. And so you wonder, we have to ask ourselves, like, how did they do that? Where did it come from? Who taught them that?
As a mother, I think that when we're raising children, we tend to organically convey to them our fears, our concerns, our rejection of things, our acceptance of things, and that's writing on the child's soul. And so not only are we imprinting them with external things, we're imprinting them with internal anxieties and fears.
Very well said, Edie, thank you. So it's in the home, but also maybe they're going to preschool. Maybe they're watching cartoons on TV.
They're little sponges at that time.
Oh, I thought that was...
No, this is Janae.
Oh, Janae, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just saying that they're little sponges at this time. They're even learning in the womb. They're having reactions to things in the womb, and they're just soaking up everything in the environment, you know, so whether we tend to think that they get everything in the home, but it's all around them.
Yes, very well said, Janae. And I like that you brought up about even in the womb, they are absorbing. And those first years of life, they're like, what is it called when you are, well, I'll say absorbing. The word I'm trying to think of, it's not coming, but absorbing is correct.
Sponges.
I was thinking of osmosis, by osmosis. They're just taking it in.
Yeah, that's a good one, yeah.
Yeah.
And also just
go ahead, Liz.
Just thinking about the cartoons, like for example, if you ask young boys, even Ninja Turtles or any other cartoon, a lot of the good characters have blue eyes, green eyes. A lot of the bad characters are depicted either with darker skin color, black eyes, red eyes, and you can even ask kids, you know, so what color eyes do good people have? And they'll say blue eyes and green eyes, depending even on just the cartoons and the shows that they're watching and who's depicted as good and bad.
Thank you. And when we become more conscious of what is going on, I mean, that little girl that said, first, I hate that he asked her that question, knowing what they're saying. Why ask the question? And the way she pointed to the black doll as being the one that was her, after asking which of these is, I don't like the project itself because it only reinforces.
Can I add something as well? Or
yes.
Is it too late?
Go right ahead, my dear.
Oh, Lord. So thank you, Bob. So something that stood out to me was the fact that how early, and this all has been touched upon, but I think I'm going to add something a little different here, is how early children are given the confidence to move forward in life as I belong here, I'm important, I'm valued, or not, right? So at that young age, it shows that the society as a whole, because those children's parents weren't teaching them, right, that they're less than, not consciously anyway. But instead, so society at that young age is teaching people of color, right, has the potential to teach people of color where their value is in society. And by the same token, teaching white people where their value is in relation to people of color. So I'm so glad you shared that video, Mom, because it shows how early this systematic prejudice, racism, et cetera, can be ingrained in the minds of an individual. And then it just gets reinforced as they get older and go through, I'm sorry, my kids keep coming in my office here. It gets reinforced as they go through life, right? And if in many cases, parents and their support system doesn't change that, then we have the problems we have today. So that's kind of what I thought when I saw the video.
Thank you so much. Well said, dear. Okay, let's go back.